So I will call this meeting of the study session to order. And I'm Laurie Urquiaga. I'm the vice chair of the Planning Commission. Lisa Jensen is with us on Zoom, and Robert Knutson is there in the room. And hopefully we will have more members joining us as the meeting goes on. Robert, you have a discussion for us about accessory dwelling units, and we'd like to finish up about 5:45.
Perfect. Thank you all. And if it's only going to be 3 of us, I think we might finish a little earlier than that. But to kind of kick us off, I do want to have a discussion about accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. I know that most of you are familiar with this, but I saw this graphic on the planning.org site, and I thought that it's helpful in understanding exactly what we're talking about when we talk about accessory dwelling units. They can be detached, and Laurie and Lisa, you can see the graphic up on the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So they can be detached, which means that they're not included in the overall footprint of the house. They can be an attached unit. They could be over a garage. They could be in the basement, like down here. They could be a separate floor in the house. They could be a converted garage, in Provo, as long as you replace the parking, that's okay. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about accessory dwelling unit. I want to go to this page really quick. So this is just a very zoomed in zoning map of a portion of the city. This is Center Street is here. So downtown area is over here. Freedom Boulevard, we're about here. I bring this up because in Provo currently, there are some specific areas where accessory dwelling units are permitted. So in zones, they're actually allowed as an overlay zone. So if you see in an R1 zoning area, if it has a suffix of an A or an S, that means accessory apartment or supplementary apartment. The other area that accessory dwelling units are allowed are in the RC, the residential conservation zone. And in the residential conservation zone, they're permitted as an accessory use rather than an overlay. And so there's a little bit of difference to that. So,
question, Robert, what's the difference, if any, between an accessory and a supplemental?
Oh, good question. So it has a lot to do with occupancy. It is really the main difference. So the A zone you'll see mostly throughout the city. Up near campus, up near BYU campus, you'll see the S overlay. In an S overlay with a conditional use permit, you can have up to 4 unrelated persons, provided you have sufficient parking and as well as the conditional use permit. In
so
the regular
4 as opposed to the 3 that's normally allowed in single family.
2, right?
Yeah. So 4 in the accessory unit as opposed to 2 in this, as opposed to 2 in the accessory unit.
Okay, so it's not to do with the overall; it's to do with that accessory. Okay.
That's correct. I should note that I'm also joined by, this is Scott Johnson. He is our zoning administrator. Back on this side, this is Jessica Donachie. She is in zoning. She's a compliance officer, and she has responsibility over rental dwelling licenses. We might get to that in a minute. But kind of to start out, just where these accessory apartments or supplementary apartments are allowed. S overlay, up to 4, conditional use permit required if you're going that high. A overlay, you can have 2 unrelated persons in there, okay? And that doesn't count against the family that's living in the dwelling unit.
So you said it's a conditional use for 4. Is there non-conditional if it's less than 4? Or is it always conditional for the S overlay?
If you're only doing 2, right?
If you're only doing 2, then it would just be the normal accessory apartment process.
Yeah.
So no conditional use permit would be required.
Yeah. And it's important to note that accessory dwellings, that word accessory is probably the most important part. These are only allowed in one family owner occupied dwellings. Okay. Otherwise, it's considered a duplex. We don't allow that.
So owner occupied is a key component as well?
Owner occupied is an absolute key component. So
is there any place where you are allowed to have multiple units on a single family lot where it's not owner occupied?
Only if it's in a different zone. So if it was in like an R2 zone, a zone that would allow for a duplex or something like that.
Okay.
The trade-off, though, is that in those situations, those aren't allowed to have accessory apartments.
Okay.
Just a different unit. Does that help you guys kind of understand where these things are allowed in our city currently?
Yes.
An important part of this conversation is that if you add up the total area where these accessory apartments are allowed in our city currently, it's about 20% of our city allows that.
So mostly all at BYU and like Mazer area?
Yeah, so a lot of the areas around BYU allow for supplementary apartments. This RC zone, which encompasses a lot of the Joaquin neighborhood and some into Mazer. And then anywhere where you see this A, which is kind of like the pioneer neighborhoods that you would consider. Okay, so a couple other things that I wanted to talk about.
Lisa Jensen has a question.
Oh, go for it.
I just wanted to know the process of deciding which ones had the supplemental overlays and which one had the accessory overlays. I know in the past it's very contentious. Some of these neighborhoods don't want to allow them. So did you just, what's the history of how you determine which areas to continue to allow and which areas aren't allowed?
So supplementary apartments, my understanding of the history was mostly directly related to campus and the proximity to BYU campus in allowing up to 4 units or 4 persons in the unit. Most areas of the rest of the city only allow the 2 just because of the neighborhood feel. That's my understanding of the history. Anything else that you want to add to that, Scott?
I'm not as familiar with the history of it. That is pretty much what I've heard.
Yeah, it predates both of us by a long shot. And then a lot of it was actually kind of just in response to things that were already happening and apartments in areas that had already been established even prior to the zoning. So this was a way to kind of rein things in a little bit, actually. This section that I have up in front of you, so this chapter 1430 actually goes through all of the development standards for accessory apartments and supplementary apartments. But this particular section is really important because this is the way our current zone or our current code allows expansion of these areas. So an overlay zone described in this chapter may only be applied to a contiguous land area of at least 4 acres that contains at least 16 existing dwelling structures, and that is at least 50% developed. That first sentence is really critical because it significantly limits where these things can be established. So you can only establish it in a contiguous area of at least 4 acres you have to have at least 16 dwelling structures already existing, and they have to be at least 50% developed. So essentially what that says is we can't apply this to a new zone. So if somebody wants to come in with building brand new houses, things like that, we legally cannot grant them that zone. The second part is the land area to which any overlay zone described shall be free from islands or peninsulas of any unreasonable boundary. Additions to an existing overlay zone are allowed so long as the resulting contiguous land area conforms to all the provisions. So essentially the way that this has been interpreted in the past is that you almost have to be contiguous not only in area, but to a zone that already allows this. There's a really good example. About 4 years ago, I was working on an application where a group of residents had come and they actually asked to have the overlay zone applied to their properties. They met all of the criteria. Planning Commission recommended approval, but eventually City Council recommended against that. They denied that zoning request. So to my knowledge, we haven't really had any expansion of the ADU areas within our city for at least the last 6 years that I know of. That's how long I've been here. But so this is a really kind of critical part of our existing code, that when we're talking about ADUs and the possibility of using those ADUs as a way to maybe even help with affordable housing and stability of neighborhoods and things like that, this one kind of comes into a little bit of problem. So I just want to stop there for a minute and get your guys' feedback on accessory apartments. What do you think about it? What have you heard? What concerns have you heard? Things like that.
Okay. Comments? Robert, Allie, Lisa?
Sure, I'll talk about it. I have heard a little bit about ADUs. I know that there are a lot of people who have properties that would facilitate one of these units that are really disappointed that they can't use their home that way. My personal opinion is that it would be a really good way to add to our housing stock quickly without having to make radical changes to the built environment of the town that we already have. I know parking is a concern for some people, but I don't know. I'm pro ADU, but that's just me.
Okay. I live in an S overlay zone and don't have a dwelling unit in my house, but many of my neighbors do. Biggest complaint that this neighborhood has is owners that move away and then rent out both the house and the dwelling unit. And the people in this neighborhood really want to have family feel to it. They don't want it to turn into a rental neighborhood. They don't mind having, we love the people who are in the accessory apartments, the young marrieds, single people. They always tell us that our ward is really welcoming and, you know, that it's a great place to live. But we're very strongly biased towards having families and making that the core of the neighborhood. And so I've heard complaints. There's in my neighborhood, there's one house that it was built just before I moved in, and it was built to be a student rental, and it's huge. It's on a corner. But it's a really, really big place, and it got a a 3-year grandfather, I guess, to let it continue to be a rental. As far as I know, it still is. And they got some kind of an exception, which has caused some bad feelings. But at the same time, I agree with Allie. It's a good way for infill. I think it's hard for the city to make sure that the rules are followed properly. And again, it's one of those things where neighbors don't want to complain, especially if you've got somebody you really like as a neighbor. But if they move out for some reason and decide to rent their home instead of sell it, then that becomes problematic. And you don't want to rat on them, but at the same time, you don't want to change the nature of the neighborhood.
Right. And I think that's a shared concern in a lot of our neighborhoods. So, Laurie, thank you for bringing that up. That was really good.
Seems like parking's always an issue too.
Robert mentioned in here that parking often can be an issue, and all of you should know that within this section of code, it actually goes through and lists all of the requirements that even if you're in an area that allows for an accessory apartment, you still have to meet these specific requirements in order to establish one on your property. Parking is one of them. You have to have 3 off-street spaces for a single-family dwelling. If you have an accessory apartment, you actually have to have 4 off-street parking spaces. You also have to accommodate the number of vehicles that are associated with the property. So even if you have 4 spaces, if there are 6 cars that are associated with that property, you still have to accommodate those 6 cars off the street. But again, these are all concerns that come up often. Anything else? Lisa, any comments on accessory dwellings?
I think I agree with both Allie and Laurie, but my greatest hang up is just the ability to enforce the standards. Whether you don't allow the apartments or whether you do allow the apartments, the fact is the people who are using them as apartments are generally the ones who aren't aware of the rules. I think in a small number of cases, it's people who don't care about the rules, but I think for the most part, they don't know there's a rule and it's a don't ask, don't tell. And so they just go ahead and keep doing it as an income property. The real estate agents certainly aren't helping. Title companies aren't correcting misinformation when someone closes on a really exciting investment opportunity. So yeah, we can talk all day long about all these great restrictions that will make these accessory apartments nice. But the fact of the matter is we've been told a million times, A, you have to rat on your neighbor if you want to change it. And B, zoning enforcement is overworked and they're going to comply and then they're going to put it right back again in most cases. So I just feel like having seen it for so many years happen in that cycle, this is just a nice little flowery subsection of code to me because it gives you a security blanket, but it's not super enforceable.
Okay, that's good, thanks. So there's kind of that dichotomy there, that there's a real need, it's really useful, but there's also some very valid concerns that come up. Dave, any thoughts that you'd like to add right now?
Well, they're probably going to sound kind of stupid because I'm joining the conversation late, so I apologize for that. But generally speaking, I'm a big proponent of accessory apartments, and just what little I've heard, I certainly experience the complaints that people lodge about unapproved accessory apartments that exist, and parking seems typically to be a big issue. It's really hard, I think, for any community to manage the enforcement side of things consistently throughout a community. And that being said, the experience that I've had recently has had to do with, really trying to be as permissive as possible relative to accessory apartments. So the focus really has been on trying to simply deal with the most significant concerns that the community has with accessory apartments. And it's really just two things. One is parking. The other is, I wouldn't even say this is more of a community thing, but really concerned about people that improve space in a home without ever getting it inspected. So finishing a basement, doing that type of a thing, and we're aware enough of some of the life safety issues that come about with that, the idea that there is a path for homeowners to legalize accessory apartments that involves a city being able to get in and do some inspections and maybe to require some fundamental things to be taken care of just to make sure that it's a safe environment for people to live in. That's been the main focus that I've been familiar with. And Robert, I'm sure you probably touched on already, just how the state legislature has kind of eroded cities' ability to regulate accessory apartments. And in some ways, at least, I don't know if that applies to any part of Provo or not. I know it's one of the communities that kind of had an exemption from the changes that were made earlier this year. Is that citywide for Provo though, or is?
So that's what we're getting to right now.
Okay.
That was perfect in a segue. Allie, I see that you have a question, but Dave, thank you for your comments, and we're going to address that. Can I mention
one more thing real quick, Robert? And then I think, like, just in terms of the benefits that I see, and it sounds like maybe this has been talked about as well. The idea that not only does it potentially provide a dwelling that otherwise wouldn't exist, which is a big deal, and it's a relatively quick way to add housing to the housing stock that we have here along the Wasatch Front, and that therefore provides additional source of income for the family that's residing in the home. But one of the things that me and some of my other colleagues have thought really would maybe take root is that also it maybe provides a path to home ownership for more people, as they can use that income to help to pay for a mortgage and that type of a thing. And, that's at least, I think, kind of the dream as well. We really haven't seen that happen a lot that we're aware of, but just again, another benefit of the concept.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. Allie.
So actually, to respond to what Dave just said, which wasn't my original thought, but it would potentially, because one of the big problems that we have is that these quote entry level homes are largely unavailable at this point. But if you did have the option of purchasing a larger home, knowing that you could turn part of it into an accessory dwelling unit, that might kind of like give a little bridge over that entry level housing issue. But my thought too, and this was just more of a philosophical thought, but I do kind of wonder, like right now, one of the problems is unregulated dwelling units that are kind of putting a sour taste in people's mouths, because it's like, this obviously isn't being run properly, but you don't want to turn in your neighbor and then also kick out people onto the streets and things like that. So having them be allowed and developing regulations in relation to that may offer more avenues for the end result isn't eviction or the cycle of evicting people and then getting up to code and then redoing it. Instead, we'd have more of an avenue for fixing the actual problems. And I just wonder if that would happen if we legalize or made them allowed in more areas. That's all.
Thanks, Ellie. I think that's a really good point, and I think that's something that we've been considering. So to jump in a little bit with what Dave was saying, with the recent legislative session, the legislature passed a law that said cities, you need to allow accessory dwelling units. Provo received a little bit of an exemption to that. In that, because we're a university town, they recognize that we need a little bit, maybe more grasp on how that is going to be occurring in our city. So the exception that the legislature made for cities like Provo, if you have a major university, you only actually have to have 30% of your area available of your residential area available for accessory dwellings. So that's why I brought up at the first, Provo currently has about 20% of its area. So in order to comply with the state, we have to at least change 10%. We have to add at least 10 more percent. But the city council has a housing committee, and we have been working through this for a long time, even much prior to the state working on their legislation. We've been thinking about accessory dwellings because for all of the reasons that you all have mentioned, that it does provide fairly quick access to additional housing. And that's something that we're seeing that we need. It also, accessory dwelling units seem to provide a little bit more stability in a neighborhood because people can be in their home for longer periods of time, in that maybe they're starting out and it's a way that they can supplement that income that Allie and Dave were saying, that they can supplement the mortgage. Maybe they get to a point where they need the additional space and they can take it back. And then maybe as they grow older, they can age in place and use it there. What's the percentage of residential area that must be accessible to I think the answer to that question is 80. That was just put in the chat. But I can't remember for certain, so don't quote me on that. But yeah, it's a substantial portion of your city.
For the benefit of the recording, we should say that the question was, outside of university communities, what percentage is required to accommodate accessory dwellings?
Yeah, and I think it's about 80. So just really quickly, thinking about those items and how we help Provo not only to comply with the state ordinance. Most other cities have already changed their rules because they were forced to. Provo gets a little bit more leeway, and we want to do this right. Given all the things that you've already mentioned, the enforcement aspect, the regulation aspect, we know in Provo that there are far more accessory apartments out there than might be allowed to be out there. And so that becomes something that we want to make sure, there's obviously a need, so we want to address it. But these are just some proposed changes that we're considering. One of the major ones that we're considering is, I mentioned at the first that a zone has to have that A or S behind it as an overlay. That's really cumbersome because then you have to go through every time you want to add an accessory apartment area or something. It's an actual legislative action. It's a zone change. Customarily, accessory apartments are treated as accessory permitted uses. The use is a dwelling, and this is just an accessory use. So one thing that we're considering is just allowing it as an accessory permitted use in our residential areas. We would actually still keep that supplemental area as an overlay area, because that one allows up to the 4. Want to make sure it's regulated properly. And so you can see that we would delete that language in here that refers to the accessory apartment overlay zone. It then just becomes a permitted use. The part where it has to be used in combination. And then this is where we would add it as an accessory use in those areas. So rather than get into the weeds really quickly, what are your thoughts on the idea of expanding the areas in Provo where accessory dwellings are permitted?
Yeah, I'll share. This is Danny. I just want to make sure that it's important that not just one area of the community has this burden of having ADU, but it's distributed throughout the city.
And so to follow up on that, Daniel, would allowing them in all R1 areas, would that accomplish that?
It could. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And again, this isn't necessarily we're going to get tons that come in. They still have to have development standards that they would have to follow. It just opens the door to allowing it. Lisa, I know that you raised your hand.
I just I think, kind of like what Danny said. I couldn't tell from your skimming through the wording of this ordinance if that was the implication. Like, were you implying that that was maybe the first step that the city would take, is just making accessory apartments available everywhere? So R1 equals accessory is allowed.
Correct.
Okay, and then the supplemental would still be an overlay because it allows you to have more than two.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for clarifying that. Dave.
Yeah, I think just in support of what Daniel said, if I understood it right, I think allowing them throughout all of the R1 zones is the only way that, right, you would kind of be uniform in terms of the opportunity that they provide throughout the community. I don't personally view them as necessarily being all that impactful on neighborhoods, but you could say you're also being consistent in terms of, sharing whatever impacts they bring to particular neighborhoods.
And benefits, right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely some things to consider in this. Any other thoughts, Laurie?
My concern, I actually personally like the idea, but for the sake of my neighborhood, I know that they worked really hard to limit the locations where accessory apartments could be. And there is a history in the Wasatch neighborhood of people just putting in their own thing without getting any kind of approval. In fact, the house that I'm living in had to be rebuilt, but before, when we bought it, it had 3 accessory units. And so that was kind of the owners had just decided, okay, we'll section this off and stick in a door, and that becomes another accessory unit. And so I do worry about those kinds of things, because I don't think the city is able to monitor that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree with Lori. Like, her neighborhood might already be at that threshold or above that threshold of 20% with having an ADU, and in that case, you wouldn't want to add much more, right?
So that becomes the question: do we just say yes anywhere, or yes in each neighborhood until it reaches 30%? Or yeah, lots of questions there. Lisa.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Sorry, Robert, do you want to answer that before I add another question?
I was just gonna piggyback one thought on that I think that sometimes the market can help us a little bit as well, that if we're only allowing it in certain areas, then maybe that area gets a bit too concentrated, whereas we could disperse the allowances in other areas, then it doesn't become overly burdened in one. That I don't know the statistics on that. I don't know what the market would bear on that, but it's just a thought that popped into my head. Lisa.
So along that thought, I think that's in most cities, that would be a true statement. But I think that's why in Laurie's neighborhood, the debate was so fierce back when they put that overlay zone on there, because proximity makes those property values go up for if an accessory dwelling unit is allowed. And so that's a concern. But my big concern that I was going to raise before was just the question of what are we going to do to budget for oversight. If this is going to be something that's going to be allowed throughout the city, which can help in multiple ways, how do we make sure it gets done well instead of people seeing somebody do it and then not following the rules, and there become so many that there's nobody to know what the rules are anymore because everyone's just running with their own plans.
Thank you. Dave.
Unmute there. I'm afraid maybe I misunderstood a minute ago. I wasn't suggesting that accessory apartments be permitted in all R1 zones up to, a certain percentage of the housing lots having accessory apartments like 20%. Is that what was being talked about? Like permitting it, but only up to a certain number of homes, maybe in a neighborhood or something like that, being allowed to have accessory apartments?
That got interjected. The housing committee's suggestion is just to allow them not to have a percentage limitation.
Okay. Which I guess would be my recommendation. I feel like trying to put a cap on the number of, let's just say, homeowners that can have accessory apartments, that becomes a nightmare to administer. And I don't know how you could tell one person yes and another person no, maybe based on a particular threshold or that type of a thing. But again, I view these as being largely, honestly, not impactful in neighborhoods. And I think different neighborhoods have different capacities to deal with maybe what comes with accessory apartments, which really it's about an additional need for cars. I appreciate what Lisa said about the need for oversight and that type of a thing. And my fallback there is create lesser needs to exercise oversight. Keep the rules simple, keep them straightforward, make it possible for people to become compliant and legal. Focus on the most, maybe grave issues that could be problems if the city's not involved in making sure the situations are safe and that type of a thing. And, then kind of just let people manage their properties as they see fit. One of the things that I think really helps kind of keep this typically in more of a self-policing kind of a scenario than what we get with other rental situations is the requirement that they be owner occupied, the properties, which I hope I didn't miss earlier. That's what we're talking about here, right? That would be a stipulation with these.
Yes.
So I think that goes a long ways towards, again, I've come to believe just that they really don't have the same impact in neighborhoods that you would have, for example, like with the duplex or, some other type of a property where the owner's not there and that type of thing. So.
Great, thank you. I think really good points. Allie.
Yes, so I don't know if I'm just confused, but I think my understanding for what we had talked about so far was that you would need to apply to the city at some point to have one of these ADUs and have it be in in good standing or legal or whatever. Is that correct? You'd need to apply?
That's correct now and correct with any sort of expansion. So you'd have to get the proper building permits if you need, and a rental dwelling license in order to do that.
Yeah. So I guess my thought then becomes it seems unfair maybe to judge the whole situation by the units that currently exist that obviously aren't meeting code because most of them are illegal to begin with, let alone what the specific units are doing inside of them. For example, that house that had just been separated into 3 units without any kind of oversight. So I still think I am kind of team if it's legal, it will be better regulated because, for example, someone who's living in a house that's doing something crazy will be more willing to come forward because the solution won't be their eviction. The solution will be modifying the property to get it in good standing with the city.
Yeah. Personally, I think I tend to agree with you, Allie. And I think that's a really good point. Laurie, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was wondering, as two questions. One, how would you inventory what already exists? And are there notice requirements, or would there be notice requirements for neighbors if somebody applied for a permit to create an accessory dwelling unit?
They're not noticing requirements currently.
No, there aren't.
Yeah, we do have an inventory of those that exist. So with the rental dwelling licenses that already exist, we have an inventory of those. The license lasts for 12 months.
Yeah, so a renewal gets sent out every year. We do not currently go back through to reinspect every year. Our code does not allow that. But we do ask that they send back notice that they're still living there and that they still want this license to be active every year.
So how do you stop somebody who just says to their neighbors, okay, we're remodeling, and their remodeling is actually building an accessory unit, and they haven't told the city?
So that would fall to our enforcement processes. If no one in the city is made aware that something is going on like that, it's really hard for us to enforce. If we are made aware that there's potentially something going on, we have many ways of investigating to try to gather as much information as we can to verify that something's going on other than what the owner is saying is going on. And there have been many instances where I myself, for one particular case in the Wasatch neighborhood, there was a house that he's initially trying to get an accessory dwelling unit because one of the owners lived there, and then that owner had moved out and filled it with college students. I went and knocked on the door one day and talked to one of the college students that was living there and just kind of chatted him up, and he told me everyone that was living there, and we were able to move forward with our enforcement in making sure the occupancy was reduced to the legal limit, and the owner got a rental dwelling license. So it's part of it is a matter of our code enforcement officers having the experience and training to know how to address people at the door and talk with various people in the neighborhood to find out what's going on, to gather information, so that if enforcement needs to happen, we can do that. And we proceeded with our enforcement as long as we need to ensure that compliance is met.
Okay, that's good. I have one more question. If somebody builds basically a mother-in-law apartment for a member of the family so that they can have sort of independent living within the home, is that included within this, or is that a separate kind of thing?
So currently that's allowed already because they're family, right?
Correct.
Right.
Okay, so then you build the mother-in-law apartment and the family moves away, and the next family that comes in thinks they have an accessory apartment already there.
So sorry, can I speak to that real quick? So yes. In doing that with a single family home that does not have a legal accessory apartment, the owner is required to sign what's called the second kitchen agreement, which gets recorded on title of the property. And what that document states is, I, as the owner, understand that I am not creating a second unit or an accessory dwelling unit, and the occupancy is limited to family only. And that runs on title with the property. And so any future owners, if they do their appropriate research into the property, they'll see, oh, this isn't an actual accessory unit. It's not a separate unit. I need to maintain the occupancy to that one family.
Okay, that's good. Other questions from members of the commission? It's 5:45, so
Yeah.
we need to finish up pretty soon.
Let me just jump in and just kind of, as people are thinking of their final thoughts or whatever, this has been really helpful. I would anticipate that you'll probably see some actual language like this in the very near future. This is something that there is a time sensitivity to this. Our members of the council that are on the housing committee they've expressed their desire to do this right rather than to do this within a specific time frame. But I think we're getting close in all of that. So I would anticipate that you'd see some applications coming before you for a text amendment pretty soon. In the meantime, if there are things that you have questions about or concerns that you have, please let me know so we can try and address those, make sure that we have all the information that you need to make good decisions and informed decisions about this. So that's basically all I have. Any further questions tonight? All righty, everybody. Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had a big family room on our house.
Mhm.
We had a
We will call to order the September 8, 2021 Provo City Planning Commission meeting. Got a quick question for staff. I believe we originally had 2 items scheduled for tonight. I guess that's still the case, but are we indeed asking that item number 2, or is it is it proposed that item 2 be continued?
Yes, we have suggested that item 2 be continued.
Do you want to discuss that at all tonight as well, or?
No, there's no discussion really beyond what the memo says that went out to Planning Commission.
Okay, great, thank you. So just one item effectively on the agenda tonight, and I guess before we get into that, we'll go ahead and do a roll call of commissioners. So if you can just state your name, please, and whether you have any conflicts or not, that would be great. We'll start with Commissioner Jones.
Allie Jones, no conflicts.
Commissioner Jensen.
Lisa Jensen, no conflicts.
Commissioner Urquiaga.
Laurie Urquiaga, no conflicts.
Commissioner Henry. We'll go on to Commissioner Gonzalez for the time being. Daniel, are you there? I know he was here a minute ago, so we'll go down to Commissioner Knutson.
Robert Knudsen, no conflict.
Great. I'm Dave Anderson, and I have no conflict. We'll try again. Commissioner Henry, you with us? I don't see Commissioner Henry or Commissioner Gonzalez with us, so we'll maybe circle back to them if they hop on with us here later in the meeting. And I'll go ahead and read in item number 1. Shawn Herring requests a variance through the Planning Commission to impact 30% slopes to facilitate a 3-lot residential subdivision located at 3605 North Foothill Drive in the R110 zone. And we will turn things over to Brandon Larson.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Again, as you noted, the applicant's requesting a variance. Typically, we don't see a variance come to the Planning Commission, but this is a Title 15 issue, and so it comes to you, and I'll get into that in a moment. He ultimately wants to develop a 3-lot subdivision, but initially he wants to be able to access the property to be able to do some geotechnical studies on the property to see how feasible it is to develop the property. It is in a fault hazard study area, at least according to our records. And so they want to get in there and take a look at the property. So what I'll do here during my short presentation is just to explain the applicant's request, highlight the code requirements, introduce the subject property to you, and offer a recommendation. I just noticed that Daniel Gonzalez just popped on. I don't know if you have a question for him or not, but I guess we can move forward later.
Unmute there, sorry. Just Daniel, do you mind stating your name and whether you have any conflicts?
Daniel Gonzalez, no conflicts.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks, Brandon.
Okay. Daniel, everyone, I'm Commissioner Gonzalez. I was just getting going here on introducing this item for a 30% slope reduction, or a variance for impacting a slope that exceeds 30%. So let me get to a couple of things here. This isn't. I was talking with Commissioner Knudsen here before we met, and reminded him, and I'll remind you, that we did see something kind of like this back in October of 2020, where a variance was requested to impact a slope that was for a slope exceeding 30%. We believe it was for a sports court or some type of outbuilding. More thinking it's a sports court. So the applicant is requesting relief from subsection 1505-161B of the city code. You can see the requirement there. It's telling us that you can't disturb hillside areas that exceed a slope greater than 30%, or that exceed a slope 30%. So so that's what the applicant's requesting is a variance from that requirement. This is a statement that he gave to us in his application. I think that's helpful. He ultimately wants to do a 3-lot subdivision. The public access is located along a steep slope. He wants to do a geotechnical study and then hopefully do a 3-lot subdivision, as I know. So that's you can read his statement there. And I'm going to go on to an important point here as we discuss a variance. So variances are granted according to 5 criteria. They are based not only in the city code, but also in the state code. Same criteria. You'll find the same criteria in both the state and the city code. So I'll just highlight the 5 briefly. One would be you can't, if you don't, so the first one would be if you don't grant the variance, it would cause an unreasonable hardship for the property owner. The second would be that you would have to find that there are special circumstances attached to the property that do not generally apply to the other properties in the area. You'd also must determine that granting the variance is essential to the applicant's enjoyment of a substantial property right that other people enjoy in the same area. And the variance cannot substantially impact the general plan or be contrary to the public interest, and it must be in harmony with the spirit of the Title 15, and substantial justice must be done. So so one thing I'll note here is, in order for you to grant a variance, you have to make a finding that all 5 of these criteria have been met. If one of them is missing, you technically should not approve it. And this next section of code from Title 15, Chapter 7, just basically establishes that the Planning Commission is the approval body for variances for Title 15 issues, which this is a Title 15 issue. So let me introduce the property to you, and we'll go from there. So this is Foothill Drive right here. You've got Little Rock Drive to the west, and then just off the map right here is Timpview High School. So this is kind of up in the northeast part of the city. This property here, and you'll see better in some photos here. It looks like it's part of a ravine and gully, whatever you want to call it. And the property is approximately 2.8 acres. It's nearly landlocked. It has a lot of elevation and slope issues with it. Let me show you this map here that was provided by the applicant. The green areas are those areas of the property that have a slope that's 30% or less. And then you can see the areas in red are those areas that exceed 30% slopes. I will note that the property owner wants to access the property right here off Foothill Drive, and it happens to be in an area where there's the greatest amount of slopes exceeding 30%. I would note here in a bit, we're going to talk about a potential, another access point that may be more plausible, or at least from the standpoint of, dealing with 30% slopes, and that may have less impact on the environment. It may offer us a more stable access point and not impact hillsides so bad. But so that area would be right here. So this map is to show you elevations. You can see at the access point that the applicant is hoping for and requesting is right here. The elevation is 5065, low points 4994, so just a little less than 5,000 or 5,000 foot elevation. So there's pretty good drop there. Over in the access point that might be more advisable is 5045, and you can see the other points I've identified on the map. This is the Terrace View Estates Plat A. It was recorded in 1962. It's a very old plat, but it's on the books. It's a recorded document and establishes roads and rights of ways and lots and so forth. And it appears to have established a right of way right there that appears to access the subject property. This part of the right of way has never been developed, as we'll see here in just a moment. I'll show you some street frontage views. Some of this plat hasn't been developed, as was approved by the city back in 1962. The road names have changed and so forth, but it is a recorded document and is a legal document. So let me show you some street frontage views of the property. This is the requested access, or the desired access point right here at approximately 3605 North Foothill Drive. Once you get past these trees, it drops off pretty good. And this is looking south down Foothill Drive, southward on Foothill Drive, pretty much at that access point. And then this is looking north at that access point. This is the other access, the alternative access point that I've noted. This is at approximately 3700 Little Rock Drive. This is part of a subdivision lot. I know the applicant has, according to his submitted documents, has had discussions with the property owner and the HOA about accessing his property through this spot right here. And let me show you. This is looking southward down Little Rock Road. Home off in the background there on the lot in the subdivision there, and this is looking northward. Didn't mean to put a Y flag in the slide on Rivalry Week, but anyway, so we've got. So that's what I've got for you is these slides that I've shown you. Staff is there's some challenges with this property. The elevation, the slopes. Public Works has some concerns about it, and they'll address that in just a moment after I'm done here. One of the things that so again, the applicant wants to get a variance so he can access this property and do some exploratory work. In doing so, there's quite, as you saw from the street view photos that I showed you, there's a lot of trees and vegetation in the area, and disturbing that land isn't going to help stabilize that area. Where staff is concerned that it would lead to increased concerns about the stability of the slopes in that area. again, on the 5 points that we noted, I'm just going to go down these really quickly. An unreasonable hardship. That's one thing that staff's particularly concerned about. Again, an unreasonable hardship, or I should note this, an unreasonable hardship is one that isn't necessarily economic in nature, and it's not one that the applicant has created of his or her own doing. So it's got to have some type of special circumstance that exists despite the actions of the owner. So I think that it's possible that the Planning Commission could find that some of the unreasonable hardships here are those that relate to the elevation of the property as it relates to the area, and makes it difficult for. It's really challenging to honestly have there's not a super feasible way to enjoy use of this property without a variance. And so elevation is maybe a real hardship for him. Special circumstances, again, that would be the elevation. Substantial property right. Now, again, this is one thing I didn't note in our presentation, but I did my staff report, is this is in the R110 zone. The R110 zone is a zone that essentially allows for one-family dwellings and some accessory residential uses. Staff's concerned that if there isn't some type of variance granted to at least allow one home, we're worried that a substantial property right may not be able to be enjoyed by the property owner. That doesn't mean that the Planning Commission has to position the applicant to enjoy 3 lots or enjoy access at the access point he's requested. The variance will not substantially affect the general plan or isn't contrary to the public interest. In my review of the general plan, I did not note anything that would affect the general plan if a variance was granted. And as far as contrary to the public interest, we've noted some concerns related to slope stability and environmental concerns that potentially may be an issue in this in this present application. Spirit of the title is observed and substantial justice is done. As I noted in my staff report, we feel like that this is in line with the purpose to encourage and facilitate the orderly growth of the development of the city, to increase the security of home life and preserve and create a more favorable environment, and to stabilize and improve property values. So substantial justice, I guess that's a debate to I guess consider whether or not variance must be granted for substantial justice to be awarded in this situation. One thing I'm looking here. One thing I would note, and you've seen it in your staff report, as far as the thing that keeps really kind of sticking out in my mind is the issue of a substantial property right, and the property rights ombudsman is a good source of information for these types of matters, and I gave you a little bit of information from them. They say regarding substantial property rights, they say it's necessary for a variance to relate to a substantial property right enjoyed by other nearby properties. It would not fully be available unless the variance were granted. The right must be one enjoyed or available to nearby properties. A variance should not be granted to establish a property right that would not be available to other properties in the same area. So I think I've kind of given you my recommendation already. the staff's recommendation is that the applicant or that the planning commission grant a variance as follows: that no more than one dwelling site be established on the subject property, and that the access be granted at the north end of the lot located at 37 North Little Rock Drive. And I'm here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Before we go on, Commissioner Henry, do you want to state your name and whether you have any conflicts or not?
Yes, sir. Brian Henry, no conflicts.
Super, thank you. I have a few questions, but let's start with Commissioner Urquiaga. Actually, maybe before we do that, or if you can maybe give me just another minute. David Day, do you have anything to add to what Mr. Larson shared?
Yeah, so I concur with what Mr. Larson has conveyed to you. The problem that we see with the access off of Foothill Drive is that it undermines the stability of the lots to the east of it. The plat that Mr. Larson showed showing that access was merely probably a hope on a developer's part of putting a road out there. We've never considered a road going out into that ravine, so that was a mistake back then, having that stub road, as you will. And so having a access off of Little Rock Drive would be perfectly acceptable, but I don't see any way that we could permit an access off of Foothill Drive. So is there any other questions you have for me?
In terms of not permitting an access off of Foothill Drive, is it because of a road grade issue that you'd run into? Is it because the road would disturb?
Yeah, road grade issue and slope stability. If you look at the topography of that section, as it goes down through there, it's very steep. The wooded nature of the hillside keeps it stable. Once you take that vegetation off, you're going to lose that stability, and we jeopardize the homes to the east.
And I guess staff's recommendation then is based on the idea that if a road comes from the other side, less vegetation's disturbed, just in general, less of the slope is disturbed.
Yeah. So if a road was to come from the other side, I don't think we would need to have any kind of a variance for 30%. I'm not sure we would need to even look at that.
From the perspective of like investigative work relative to doing a geotechnical analysis of the site, seeing if there are any issues there, is
that's kind of the stage we're at right now, is they wanted to get down in there and do some geotechnical investigation, and we did not feel comfortable with permitting any of that until the Planning Commission had a chance to look at whether we want to disturb that 30% slope or not. If the request was to come from the west side off of Little Rock, then I think that would be something that we could permit without needing a variance.
Conceivably, though, having whatever's done to identify whether there are any particular concerns with putting a home, driveway, road, anything like that on the subject property, it's possible that doing that work might uncover something that would render the property useless. Yeah. Fair to say.
Yeah, so once they get down in there and do their geotech work, they'll do some earthquake fault trenching as well as soil analysis and slope stability. And then we would be able to determine appropriate locations where houses could be built. But in order to get to that point, we've got to get, equipment down in there to do that investigative work. Our fear was that we do unrepairable damage to the hillside on the east just to investigate whether we can build or not. We suspect there's faults in the area. There's also that drainage channel that kind of comes down through there. All of those sort of hazards would need to be avoided with any type of building envelope.
So I kind of feel like it's similar coming from the west, though, that likewise there'd have to be some kind of effectively a road cut in to get equipment on the property, to cut trenches and do that type of thing. We're talking probably about some pretty heavy duty equipment, I would assume, to get deep enough to be able to see what's underneath the surface.
Yeah, normally a track hoe that would dig about 20 feet deep would be a normal type of equipment you would get down in there. You would dig the trench and then you would compact it back in place. While the trench is open, the geotech people get down in there and evaluate if there's any faulting or anything in that area. So, but the difference being that site is not over 30%.
Okay. Okay. Anything else, Mr. Day?
I think Mr. Henry had a question. I don't know if that's for me or for someone else.
Tell you what, it looks like he does, but we'll go to Commissioner Urquiaga first.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. And that was helpful to know. My question has more to do with legalities than the actual slope, although I think that that's really important. If we were to, I don't know that we can approve an entrance from Little Rock Drive because the city does not own that. Is that correct?
No, the city does not own that property. It would be a situation where they would have to work with the property owner. And I know they've had conversations with that property owner, but yeah, they are not applicant to the application.
But
that situation may change in that that homeowners association has petitioned the city council to take over their roads and their utilities, and the city council is considering that request right now. So that situation may change in the near future.
But we are not able to bind a private owner to anything that we're doing here.
That's right.
Okay. That was probably my biggest question. And then Brian was after me.
I guess that was my question is that lower owner even interested in selling that property? That would make this decision a lot quicker. Is the owner here tonight, and is it possible to hear from them now?
That is Mark Hyde, and he has his hand raised.
Yeah, do we have any other questions from the commission of staff before we turn some time over to the applicant?
Okay, I guess I do have one question for Mr. Day. Has there been any other previous work done that maybe in a city meeting that would show us whether there are issues?
We're not aware of any geotech work that has been done in this specific location.
Okay.
Faulting is so erratic that you basically have to be right on the site to find where that fault is. They're hard to like project a line because they move so much. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's all I have for now.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Jensen.
I am looking at this slope map, and the access that's been suggested looks like it's so benign with all those green stripes far apart. But is it really going to be safe for, it's like it's no worse than the houses that are already built there? I just want to make sure that the alternate plan is still not fairly risky.
Well, it still does have an elevation change. It's a lot less. I thought I'd seen another map, and I should have. I can pull that up, but I thought I'd seen a slope map, another slope map that showed 30% slopes in that area. The map data that we use as staff, but I can check on that later. But yeah, it's hard to say. I guess I don't know if you have anything more to add on that, David. I mean, it is definitely definitely a more doable location.
Yeah, coming off of the west side, if that's able to be worked out, is much preferred. It's probably the only option in my mind. Looking at the steepness of the slope, the slope is well in excess of 30%. We're not talking a slope that's hovering around 30%. We're well in excess of 30% here. We're probably 50%. I'm sure that their engineer or Mr. Hyde could probably give us a number on how steep that is, but I've walked it. It's the type of slope where you're pulling on a tree to take your next step to get up it. So it is very steep.
Mr. Day, are you talking about the east one when you say it's that steep, or are you talking about the west one?
East, sorry. Yes, the east side is very steep. The west side, you could walk right down it. It's a pretty gentle slope.
Thank you. That's good to know, because as I was looking at the images from the street view, it looks like they're both similar slopes, but maybe that's because you go straight for a while and then it goes down steeply on that east side.
Yeah, that would be the off of Little Rock right there. So
thank you.
I know there are, it's a private road. Bill talked about that may change in the near future. We don't really have an answer on that as to whether that'll be a public or private road, probably for the next couple of months.
Excellent.
But that would definitely be the best location if that's able to be worked out.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question. Maybe this is for Mr. Pepperoni or Mr. Larson, but I noted on the property tax records that the sale of this property was in February of this year. So does the recent acquisition of the property play into the hardship that we weigh in with the variance if it isn't something that they've had for ages and ages and the laws have changed while they had it and now they can't do anything with it?
No, I don't think in this case the chain of title or dates of ownership has much impact as it relates to the variance criteria. This property has been a parcel since I traced it back to 76. I don't know if Brandon's gone back further than that, but it's been a distinct and privately owned parcel since 76, and it's been zoned R110 for most of that time, or even before that time.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, a hardship has to be something that that the owner doesn't create. I think that elevate. I think that the hardship here is the elevation and topography, and that's nothing to do with the owner. That's not the owner's doing.
Commissioner Henry.
Yeah, one more quick question for clarification. So the variance tonight is whether or not we're allowing a road on the east side. Is that what I understand?
It's to impact 30 slopes exceeding 30%.
Which would lead to an access from the east so that equipment could get in there to do a soil study.
Right. But then there was something else mentioned about limiting the property to only one single family dwelling. Does that have to do with the variance, or is that just a condition if we grant that variance from the east side?
They also want to do a 3-lot subdivision eventually. The initial geotechnical work would be done to see if it'd be feasible to do a 3-lot subdivision. If it's feasible, they would like to do a 3-lot subdivision. Our recommendation is that they do access from the west and only allow that the variance be conditioned upon only one dwelling site and not 3.
Okay, that's all I've got for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll go back to Commissioner Urquiaga.
Thank you. This is for David Day. I'm wondering with the, is the slope from Little Rock more than 30% or less?
Our map's saying no, but you can.
Yeah, so there are probably isolated areas that could be 30%, but if you look on the map that's being displayed right now, or was displayed,
they'll be displayed again.
That green area means that there's no 30% on that west side.
Okay, I see some patchiness that is reddish,
yeah, so
like right along that line.
Where I'm referencing is kind of right where the arrow is, and that would be most likely where an access would be able to come in across that little narrow strip of private property there.
Okay, so if the owner were to choose to use that route, even if we denied the variance, that would not stop anything. Is that correct?
Yeah, if they were able to work that access out, they would not need this 30% variance.
Okay, and since it's already zoned, if they work it out, then it's really bringing the plan back to us, basically. Or do they even have to do that when it's an R1?
It's a critical hillside.
No.
It is critical hillside.
So it is critical hillside, but I don't think that means that I'm not recalling. I mean, we had to bring back. I do not believe that it does. I can check on that, but I'm not aware of the requirement to bring it back.
Typically, we do not bring subdivisions to the planning commission if it's zoned property. What staff is debating is we've recently adopted the hillside overlay zone, and we don't believe that requires this from the planning commission.
Right, and I don't remember this part being part of that necessarily because we excluded existing plats.
No, this is crosshatch that is part of the hillside overlay zone.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. I think we're ready to hear from Mr. Hyde, if the chair agrees.
That way, yeah, thank you. Mr. Hyde, do you have anything to add to what staff shared?
Thank you. I appreciate the Planning Commission looking at this issue, and I very much want to thank the staff of Provo City, David Day, Bill Pepperoni, and Brandon Larson for their hard work. I know they put in hours at this. I think I can clarify several points here. First of all, I'm glad this map is still up on the board for everybody. If you go to the top left corner there on Little Rock Drive, the part that's outside of my property, that is red between the street and my property. That would be red critical slope portion there as well, greater than 30%. But it is it's like 5 feet long. It's super, super small. I do want to bring up a point, and I think this kind of covers several points in that I have gone the rounds with Quail Valley HOA as far as trying to get access from that standpoint. I initially approached the neighbor, and they were more than happy to sell me access at that point up there on the top left corner of the property from Little Rock Drive. but it's part of 12 Valley HOA, which is private, including the road. And I've offered them a large sum of money, and I've tried several different approaches and just a couple of responses. While we sympathize with your situation, we decline access through our HOA. Please understand that we cannot approve or access Little Rock Drive and would request that you dismiss that proposal from your plans. I've gone that route for months, and that's just not an option for me at this point. If the city has some other way of intervening and taking over that property, I am more than happy to access from Little Rock Drive, but it is not an option. The only access point, and the only one I think you need to consider tonight, is from Foothill Drive, because that is the only legitimate access point at this point. The private property side is just not even an option. Foothill Drive side is the one that the city has always had as the stub way of accessing this property. And all I'm asking for is the same right that each of my neighbors around there has, and that is access to their property. I'm an R1 10 zone, just as each one of them is. The city knew that they needed access to it, and perhaps it was a poor choice of access, but it is what it is. And I just want to make two other very quick points, and that is, it's very steep coming down from there. I know we have had engineers look at it. It is possible to make a nice 7% grade along the side with retaining walls and a 10-foot wide driveway that would be minimally impactful there. Sure, it will have impact, but I believe it would be minimally impactful. When you look at the whole property, again, it's 2.8 acres, 15% of it is critical slope. So 2.3 acres of it is still very good property. When you get in the bottom of it, it's just kind of more rolling property. It's not these huge steep slopes. We still have to do the seismic studies, but all the maps demonstrate that seismic fault lines will likely fall along the east side, leaving plenty of room to the west to still build a lovely home. I feel very drawn to this property. My heart is set on it. I was so excited and feel it was miraculous to be able to procure it in February. And I would just hope that you would see favorably, as the planning committee has suggested, Mr. Larson suggested, improving this access to our property.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde. Planning commissioners, any questions for the applicant? Commissioner Urquiaga.
Thanks again, Mr. Hyde. The applicant was Shawn Herring. Are you in partnership with him, or what's your circumstance with this property?
Mr. Herring is the owner of Regional Design Engineering. He's been my engineer that works with the city and works with projects in general, trying to get through this part of the process. And so I've relied upon his expertise to help me in trying to negotiate some of the challenges associated with this property.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant? I don't see any hands raised, and I'm already out of practice. I think our next step is to go into the public hearing. I seem to recall that we need some help from staff to make that happen. Can we go ahead and do that now?
Okay. Ms. Murray, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My name is Taz Murray. We own the property just to the north of the property that you're considering. I just wanted to make a couple of and I really appreciate you guys opening this up to public forum and making sure that we're all aware of it. We all have a few concerns. One of them, when I say we all, my neighbors and I, but I'll speak just for me at the moment. Mr. Hyde mentioned that he approached the property owner to the west. That would be Leo Widener, my friend and neighbor, who recently passed away. He suffered from pretty severe dementia right up until he passed away. His wife, Shirley, I don't know if she's on the call or not, owns the property. And so there is no access from the west side, as Mr. Hyde said, because the property is between the road, even if it is a public road, and his property. There's a piece of private property between that. So I just wanted to make sure that you were all aware of that, because there's no access there without purchasing the property or whatever. And I don't think she's interested at the moment of selling. Our concern mostly relates to what you've already talked about, erosion concerns. There's a lot of oak trees down there. That's pretty powdery stuff. I'm concerned about getting seismic equipment in there from the west, from anywhere that requires a backhoe to go in there and creates quite a bit of vibration. We have a large pool in the back of our house that's on a elevated slope. And I'm concerned about destabilization of that with any sort of activity that goes on back there. We're all very concerned about fire. Recently, there was a fire that came up from Timpview side that almost wiped out 2 houses without a little bit of help from on high. With the wind changing, I think we would have lost 2 houses. And imagine that from the gully below coming up and threatening all the houses on the rim. And I think almost everybody that lives on that rim, including us, are very concerned about that. So with erosion concerns, no matter where you access that property, I feel a little bit like Little Orphan Annie. You guys talked a lot about the east side and the destabilization that would happen there and the irreparable damage that would happen if you get on there with a backhoe. I think we would suffer the exact same thing on the west side with irreparable damage. Those oaks have been there for I don't know how many years, and it takes a long time to grow it. So and it takes up a lot of ground, and it's very it creates quite a bit of stability in the soil. So I'd hate to see that disturbed in any way, and the track hoe would definitely do that. So I know I only have 2 minutes, so I'll summarize by saying I would be opposed to any building down there for those reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Murray.
Yeah.
Can we go to the next participant? So looks like I'm seeing a couple of hands raised. One phone number ends in 210. Do you want to state your name and go ahead and share your thoughts with the commission?
Caller 210, we'll come back to you. Caller 716, go ahead. Press *6 to unmute.
Yes, am I on? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Brian Gibson. I'm from Provo. So I live directly to the south of the proposed road on the Foothill side. Before I get into the details of my feelings about this issue, I just want to say that I believe there's a great deal of community opposition to this on both sides. I've met and heard from people on the Foothill side, but also the Little Rock side. I'm opposed to any development in the gully for a number of reasons: fire risk, the fault lines and earthquake risk, the vehicular access in the event of emergencies, the environmental impact on plant life and wildlife. If access to the gully is allowed, then even though I agree with my community members on the Little Rock side, it shouldn't come through the Foothill side. By the very map that we've seen tonight, about 50% of the proposed road is on a slope steeper than 30 degrees. The staff's report said that 2 geotech companies hired by the owner have already said it's inadvisable. I learned tonight that there's a security threat to the stability. Well, there's a threat to the stability and security of my actual home if this road is built. And it is a very high likelihood, acknowledged in the very appeal letter that was sent by Mr. Herring, that there might be fault lines discovered on the property. And if the trees are knocked down and the slope is made unstable and nothing can be built there because of fault lines, it's all for nothing. So I'm certainly opposed to any development whatsoever in the gully. Fire risk has already been mentioned. Everyone was asked that borders on the perimeter of the gully in recent months to clear 33-foot distance from their structures of any fuel, and we all, to some cost for many of us, we had to clear trees. So to build down there, I think is very ill-advised, and I think that it's one thing for Mr. Hyde to say that he has a right to enjoy and develop this property, but that right does not mean that he has a right to put my family and my property in danger or to make it any less stable for those of us who live on the perimeter of the gully. That's it.
Mr. Gibson?
Yep.
Can you help us with the next caller?
Caller 210, go ahead. Press *6 to unmute. Hello?
Sorry, can you hear me? This is Aaron Miller from Provo.
Yes, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So my wife and I are the owners of the property at 3655 Foothill Drive, which is situated just north of the proposed access point on Foothill Drive. As you can see from the map, our property extends along the majority of the proposed access road. And as you notice from that map, also by looking at it, there's a substantial grade. It's very steep. A lot of our yard is actually part of that very steep slope, and it takes steps cutting the hill to get up and down it. Obviously, our primary concern is the damage that might be done to our property should the access be granted, the variance be granted, and then it affects the stability of our property. I did send an email yesterday as part of a comment. We actually we attempted similar geotech work to build an additional structure next to our home. We saw firsthand the damage that the geotech work does. It's dramatic. It actually changed substantially how we dealt with that property, and ultimately it was a failed effort because we found four fault lines in that property that made it so additional structure couldn't be built anywhere in a way that had an adequate setback from the fault lines. So those are our concerns. Obviously, we hope that at the very least, and I just want to say I'm grateful to the commission for weighing all these considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We acknowledge that we did receive that additional input from Mr. Miller via an email that was delivered to us yesterday. Thank you. The next caller, I'm seeing caller 009.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Kyle Matthews, 3630 Little Rock. Just a couple of comments. I think that staff has done a nice job putting the report together, but a number of the comments tonight concern me, and I just want to point out that I think that any of the comments about stability, erosion, the steepness, the impact on the woods apply at both locations, whether it be Foothill or Little Rock. As Mr. Hyde, the applicant, indicated, he's come to the Homeowners Association on 2 occasions and been turned away. He has made it very clear what his application is tonight, and he's asking for a variance to Foothill. So I think that if there's any consideration to granting a variance that is not even legally binding at this point, to granting anything onto Little Rock, it would be ill-advised by the Planning Commission to do that. It's not even the variance that was requested. I think you need to consider that and deny staff's recommendation on that point. And again, just look at what the applicant is looking for and evaluate his variance and his request at that point, something that was considered back in the 1960s, and limit your review to something that would actually be binding if it were passed. So I appreciate the opportunity and thank the commission for allowing us to participate.
Mr. Matthews, thank you. We'll move on. It looks like we have one more caller 035.
This is Jeff Cutler I'm the president of the Quail Valley HOA. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And so we had declined earlier after Mr. Hyde had come to us, and just our concerns was some of the main ones is just the possible damage to the road going in with the construction equipment, and just the feedback when we talked to the neighbors coming in from Little Rock Drive along the path where the construction equipment would be going in. It was just a resounding opposition to that due to the traffic and the damage to the road and the noise on that. So we do sympathize with the owner. It's a nice area down there, certainly. It's a nice, quiet area, but those are some of the reasons why we denied access to our private HOA. And plus, we're trying to get a process started with the city in a discussion about the roads and utilities under that, so we didn't want any damage to the streets due to that also. But that's our comments.
Mr. Keller, that's very helpful. Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak during the public hearing?
There are no public comments at this time. 30 seconds. Caller 912, go ahead.
Hi, this is Haley Gibson from Provo on the east side of what we're talking about. So my concern, assuming that this goes through and it's built particularly on the east side, because that's what affects me, is the increase in traffic. Foothill is already an extremely busy, dangerous street. So I think in addition to all of the ecological damage, all of the other things we have talked about, there are some pretty big ramifications of this for me and my community. So I just wanted to voice that I am also opposed.
Thank you, Ms. Gibson. Are there any other people that would like to comment during the public hearing this evening?
No one at the moment. 30 seconds. No public comments.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We will close the public hearing then, and we'll turn the discussion back to the commission. I don't see any other hands raised. I'm assuming that there are a number of points that we'll want to discuss. I know I have a handful. Commissioner Urquiaga, you want to lead out?
Sure. I don't know if this is one of the ones that you have on your mind, but my understanding is that with the zoning as it currently exists, Mr. Hyde has a right to investigate his property for stability and so on. So if he chose to put the equipment in, take it in by helicopter so it didn't do any road, which there would be no legal impediment to doing something like that. Financially, certainly, but that my understanding is that our hands are bound when it comes to the current zoning on the property and the right of the property owner to investigate development within the parameters of that zone. And maybe this is for the city to confirm, but is that where we're at?
Yeah, would somebody on staff like to share their perspective? I kind of have a perspective too that I'd like to share, but.
What sent this to the planning commission was the inability to come into the property without affecting 30% slope. I suppose if there were a proposal to somehow do the geotechnical investigation without affecting 30% slopes, then yes, we'd have to permit that.
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you.
Which I guess might maybe follow up on that, just relative to the criteria that have to be met for a variance to be issued. I'm just flat out afraid of the idea that an inherent property characteristic, like a property's slope, could be found to be, something that somehow alienates that property from being able to used in a way that's consistent with surrounding properties, included in the same general plan designation and those types of things. I appreciate what staff, I think, is trying to do, which in my opinion and just kind of perspective is to try to come up with some way to allow the applicant to do something with their property. I'm really concerned about the idea that, something like a property's slope, that's the key issue here, right? Which that is not the result of the type of regulatory provisions that I guess I'm accustomed to seeing variances be granted for. It's just an inherent characteristic of the property. And there you have it. That I think is my most fundamental concern. Commissioner Jensen.
Before I ask my question, Mr. Anderson, does that mean that you are alarmed that that's something that we have been asked to regulate, or that you are feeling compassion for the owner that they have to ask for that? Or can you clarify what you mean by that being your concern?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess personally, I don't feel like that's fair game, that granting a variance so that someone doesn't have to respect a standard that's intended to restrict the disturbance of sensitive lands, like lands that have a slope of 30% or greater. I could try to maybe explain it differently, but I think that's my fundamental concern, is that I don't believe the property does have reasonable access. I don't think it's ever had that. I believe that had the property been accessible back when the surrounding properties were developed previously, that the property would have been developed then. I think not every property is usable, is developable, is in such a condition that it can enjoy the same rights as surrounding properties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if that clarifies. I'm kind of struggling, I guess, to articulate everything that I'm thinking here, but that's
that helps me to see what your concerns are. My thoughts were more on whether there's alternative solutions besides the ones that we've been talking about. And I wondered if instead of granting this variance, that we could look at it from the perspective that the owner could subdivide his land and sell off portions to each of the adjacent parcels. If, they can't develop it either, but it would guarantee that nobody else has to ask the question and he still gets to use his land. I don't know. I'm just trying to think outside the box of ways we could say it's clear that this land isn't logically developable, especially as proposed, but here's something you can do with it.
I see that as maybe being the most beneficial way to put the property to use personally. That'd be entirely up to the applicant if they wanted to pursue that, you know, and the adjoining property owners, but I don't see other hands, so I'll mention a couple of other things and maybe ask staff to correct me if I'm seeing this the wrong way, but the applicant's comments about being able to access the road from the west and how that's not a possibility. What does that do to staff's recommendation?
Yeah, that doesn't change our recommendation.
So you're recommending that the applicant only be allowed the variance to access the property from the west. Is that right? Or did I misunderstand that?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. If the applicant can't access the private road and can't cross the private property, then they're effectively just in a bind in that regard.
No, I'm not convinced of that. In discussions I've had with the attorney's office, I'm not convinced of that, Mr. Anderson.
Okay. Okay. Commissioner Henry?
I don't know if this is just reasonable common sense that is being missed here, and I don't know what level the Planning Commission has, but I know in Provo there have been a couple of properties where rights were granted to build, and during construction, I mean, rock slides into the back of homes and homes knocked off their foundations, especially up here on these hillsides. I'm just trying to figure out, where do we look at the reasonable development of this land and say, that's just not a smart place to put homes? I mean, I know when I bought my home, I went to the state website to look at all the environmental hazards that could potentially affect the home I bought, and found on the state website there's liquefaction, mudslides, flooding, rock slides, earthquakes, fire. There's all these environmental hazards that I know in this particular place, Little Rock Canyon used to flow into this channel. I know there's a bunch of houses and roads there now, which how that ever got approved in the past baffles me, with all the potential environmental hazards. And now we're looking at building homes in the bottom of a gully that could be affected by liquefaction, mudslides, rock slides, flooding, earthquake. At what point do we come and say, this is just not a good place to build homes? And what ramification do we have? Yes, it's a beautiful piece of land now until you scrape it clean and start building plots. What beauty is left? And I just don't want to be that planning commission that somebody down the road is saying, who approved this? So I guess that's more a comment than a question, but I don't know. At what point does environmental factors say this just isn't a good idea?
Thank you, Commissioner Henry. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, so I come to this with a background, some coursework in geology, graduate coursework in environmental planning, and then early on in my legal career, working on ordinances with the city of Mapleton on hillside protection. And, you know, everything that I've researched and studied just does not suggest that, if there's one takeaway that I got, was that never build on a hillside. There's just too much exposure to environmental damage and health and life and safety for surrounding neighbors. There's major stability issues. And my fear would be, in granting this, just opening up, exposing the city to some liability and allowing a building to, you know, habitations be built where it's not safe. That's all.
Commissioner Gonzalez, thank you. Commissioner Jones, I think you were next.
Thank you. I do echo the sentiments of Commissioner Henry and Commissioner Gonzalez. I think that that is just really not a great area to develop given the slope and the increased risk that comes with removal of vegetation and cutting into the slope for road and things like that. I do wonder, however, if that discussion is outside of the scope of what we're trying to determine right now. That being said, I do think that granting access to this road that has very high potential of interfering with the safety and stability of the homes that surround it would just be unfair to the current homeowners and dangerous in general.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. Commissioner Jensen.
I just had two things to follow up with that come from the property rights ombudsman and also from the requirements for granting a variance. And the first one says a variance should not be granted to establish a property right that would not be available to other properties in the same area. And to me, if this has a greater slope than other properties in the area, then it doesn't have the same circumstances as those other properties. Then the second one from the rules for granting a variance says the variance will not substantially affect the general plan and will not be contrary to the public interest. I feel like building in a dangerous area is contrary to public interest. So as we've discussed, the instability that it could cause for surrounding properties. So I feel like we've kind of got the language from other formal guidance documents that would tell us this isn't a good idea as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Jensen. Commissioner Urquiaga.
Thank you again. I would follow up with, agree with Commissioner Jensen. I was wondering about whether this would be in the public interest. That's the element that I have concern about. I want to make it clear as a commissioner that all we're talking about is access to the property, and whether or not we think that it makes sense to develop that property, it is already zoned. And so once it is zoned, and it has been zoned for a very long time, that may have been an unwise decision by a city council, decades ago, but they did it. And so the owner has the right to develop. If he had a flying car, we would not be talking about this and he'd be building a house. We're talking about access, but this variance, and I, looking at the requirements that the things that we are needed to find, the criteria that we are required to determine, I'm not sure that putting a road on this particular slope is not contrary to the public interest. So that's my summary.
Can you clarify for us, Commissioner Urquiaga, you believe it is consistent with the public interest to grant?
I believe it is contrary.
It is contrary. Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to follow up because I think you're zeroing in on kind of my main concern as well. And I agree with, I think, what all of the commissioners have shared. But, like Commissioner Urquiaga mentioned, the property is zoned, and zoning does provide certain rights, but those rights can only be enjoyed if properties can meet the necessary criteria, comply with certain regulations and those types of things. And I think we likely could find properties all over Provo, all over different communities that, while they might have some zoning right, those rights aren't enjoyable because of a number of different things. And I think, the slope of a property might often be one of those things. So, the rights are qualified without a doubt. That's hence I think, the proposal to grant a variance here. And I don't think that a failure to grant the variance necessarily is taking away any right that's enjoyed right now. I don't think that right necessarily can be enjoyed. Commissioner Henry.
Yes, I just had a thought about the lower entrance. The city has asked us to consider requiring only from the west side. And the question now comes up, he only needs access to investigate the property is all he's asking for. He doesn't need to buy the property to do that. I guess that's my question. Is it possible that that homeowner could allow him across the property to access the property from Quail Valley Drive to investigate the property without having to purchase that property? I mean, I've allowed neighbors across some of my properties in the past. And I guess that's what we're considering tonight, is whether he can go in there and just investigate. That does bring up concerns still of destabilizing the hillsides because of the removal of vegetation and other, again, environmental issues that I'm really struggling with tonight. But I guess, does staff believe, is that why they made that suggestion, is that the property doesn't have to be sold to allow access to the property from that homeowner down below?
Our recommendation didn't necessarily come from that train of thought, but my understanding is, yeah, I guess the property owner could allow access across his property. And the Public Works Department has said here that it appears that it could be a reasonable area to somewhat more, certainly more reasonable than the other side to access.
So then I wonder what kind of, I mean, wow, there's so much information missing here with where the geotech would need to dig and how much destruction to the hillside, what guarantees all that destruction would be repaired, vegetation replaced, hillside stabilization. There's a lot of questions there that if he does go in and investigate, that we don't cause problems for the neighbors if he can't do anything with the property. I would want to see something if the variance, as the city has requested, to allow that access. And I don't know if the HOA has to approve that or if that homeowner alone can approve access across his site. There's just a lot more questions here that keep popping into my head, where he's just looking to investigate the site. He's not looking for approval of home sites. Does that now change that access from the west side? I mean, I still think it's a terrible idea to build homes here just because of all the environmental potential destructive things, but yeah, are there any protections the city needs or requires to repair any damage done for this investigation?
It's customary to require a revegetation plan. And although, you know, when you're taking out mature oak trees, revegetating those is, well, almost impossible unless you have 50 years to work on it.
Right. And would there be any bonding to require that revegetation, or is it just we expect this?
No, yeah, we go through a process of estimating what it costs to revegetate that, and it would be collected in a bond.
Okay. Would the city have any say on where those trenches should be, or any guidance to disturb the least, as well as to protect the hillside for the homes above?
So the trenching would be under the direction of the professional that's doing the work, and okay, where they felt like the most advantageous locations to identify faults and stuff would be. So that would be left up to them to make a good judgment of where to dig.
And to revegetate, obviously, yeah, oaks are impossible to transplant. They can't bring them in from somewhere else. You just got to grow them really naturally on the hillside. So to revegetate, using different ground covers, using other trees, maybe native trees like boxwood, not boxwoods. What are they called? All the maples all over the hillside. Would that type of thing be required to revegetate, or would it just be erosion mats that and native seed re-veg?
Yeah, normally we don't specify trees as part of the revegetation. It's more of the ground cover.
Okay. Okay. Those are my questions.
So the idea of the property being accessed from the west, I mean, the applicant saying essentially that he's not interested in pursuing that. And I guess, you know, that is what it is, but that makes it kind of hard for me to really take that as a likely option, I guess, at this point moving forward. And maybe that's completely irrelevant. But, you know, again, just kind of back to what for me is the fundamental, which is that cities adopt regulations for all kinds of different reasons. Some of the reasons, maybe not all of them, that cities adopt regulations relative to sensitive lands like slopes. I mean, there are aesthetic considerations. There are all kinds of different safety considerations, both, I would say, life safety considerations, property improvement, you know, safety considerations. I think in fairness, we don't know if there's anything about the property that, you know, like there would be faults there or that sort of a thing that would make it a challenge to build on. But you know, certainly accessing the property creates disturbances that the hillside ordinance is all about trying to prevent. I think it's one of the fundamental reasons we spent the time that we have in the past few years talking about having hillside development standards and that sort of a thing. And, you know, the idea that the 30% rule, you know, could be the subject of a variance. Again, that's alarming for me. So, I don't see any other hands. I don't know if the commission's inclined to take action tonight. I think if anyone would like to make a motion, we might be getting, you know, to the point to where it's appropriate to do that. It's my understanding that the planning commission is the, I'm used to saying the appeal authority when you're talking about a variance, land use authority, something like that. We are the ones that would take action on it. And I think it's probably appropriate if somebody makes a motion that they do their best to describe as fully as they can, you know, all of the reasons for making the motion that they're making. Those are maybe my last thoughts. Commissioner Henry.
I guess another question for staff. If we were to grant the variance from that east side access, as a condition of granting that variance, could we require like rhino rock retaining walls to permanently be installed, whether he can build or not, to protect the neighbors above due to the erosion or due to the disturbance of the slope, that no matter what happens, they're protected?
I believe you have the ability to add conditions to your approval. So I have no reason to believe you couldn't do that. So.
Okay.
I would echo what Chair Anderson just said. When you make a motion with a variance, I think it's really helpful, especially if this were to, some of these can be appealed and go on to court settings. And so it's good and important to have findings along with your motion. So
Commissioner Jensen.
In response to Commissioner Henry's suggestion, I would hesitate to believe that even the best of retaining walls would be a catch-all for this. We've seen so many houses that have slipped off of hillsides that we're trying to retain. So I don't know that I want to have that on us either. But that's just my thought on that.
The type of retaining wall I was thinking of, Commissioner Jensen, was the Reiner rock style that they use along freeways. They use them in Provo Canyon. They're a very robust wall that, I mean, he would need to be at least probably 20 to 30 feet from any property line before he built that wall. It would be, I'm not talking like, yeah, landscape consumer wall. I'm talking a pro grade quality wall that would ensure that those hillsides don't slip, or at least I guess you can't really ensure that. But again, it's just to me, it's a terrible place to build a house.
And I agree with what Commissioner Henry's saying about this being a suitable building site. And again, I'm just going to go back to why we have hillside development standards. The idea that there would, and I think the applicant described that there would be a retaining wall to build a road, driveway, whatever it would be to provide access from the road to the east to the 3 home sites that he's proposed. I have no idea what kind of height then you have on the walls that would allow for a road to be built at a 7% grade through that ravine and those types of things. But certainly those, among other things, absolutely impact the aesthetics of the area and the community. And I believe that those are very sound reasons for having hillside development standards, that you don't necessarily want big exposed retaining walls and different things like that. Which again, the standard that we're talking about here, encroaching upon slopes of this kind of grade, that for me is, it's not necessarily a magic number, but communities, I think, have to draw the line someplace, and I think that's a very appropriate place. Created that rule and that standard at 30%, and I think it would be a mistake to deviate from that.
If I could add, Mr. Chairman, the road was added back in the 60s. Since then, we have added the critical hillside overlay, which to me sounds like we're trying to fix and prevent this very thing. Like we're trying to correct those mistakes of the past with that overlay. So to now make a variance around it, why did we put it in place?
And, I appreciate you mentioning that, because that is kind of, I guess, part of the jumbled thoughts that I have in my head. I don't believe the foothills of Provo would develop today like they developed, in previous decades, right? I mean, knowing what we know about best practices in terms of hillside development, those sorts of things, development throughout that part of the community, I think is the case probably throughout much of the United States, in areas like this would look different now than it did before. And that probably would have helped to alleviate some heartache and economic loss and different things like that property owners in the city has experienced because of how the areas have developed, and the effort that I think the community has undertaken to try to appropriately regulate development in these kinds of environments is to adopt things like these hillside development standards. So, in that regard, for me, it's very different than another zoning standard, right? Like talking about deviating from the setback for one building to let it be closer to a property line, where absolutely it'd be hard to conceive of how that potentially would create, any kind of a life safety issue or that sort of a thing, or where maybe, aesthetic considerations would be much less significant than in this kind of an environment. And so really for me, it's the nature of the standard that we're talking about and the idea that would be deviated from that has me the most concerned. I was so optimistic when you had your hand raised a moment ago, Commissioner Jensen, that you were ready to make a motion. There we go, Commissioner Urquiaga.
I guess I will step up because I know this is going to be one that is complicated. With respect to the owner's property rights, I move that we deny this application for a variance through the Planning Commission to impact 30% slopes to facilitate three-lot residential subdivision located at 3605 North Foothill Drive. And the considerations upon which I am making this motion are that this variance would be contrary to the public interest and has the potential to impose a substantial injustice upon the uphill slopes of this property. Simply even the initial road construction. While I do believe there is a hardship, I don't believe it is unreasonable. And that if there are other ways to access the property that the owner can arrange, then that is a different question. But in terms of this particular variance and the 30%, I move that we deny.
Commissioner Urquiaga, thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. It's Commissioner Knudsen with the second. Any discussion on the motion?
Yeah, we might want to consider incorporating by reference the hillside overlay ordinance, because there should be some purpose or intent that should be included there. We probably should have pulled it up, but I imagine that the ordinance includes some health and safety reasons.
Yeah, I would say that the hillside overlay that already applies to that does not need to be incorporated again. But the fact that we are considering it as part of it, it's a package.
Commissioner Urquiaga, I like the conditions that you've spelled out. I also, I like maybe what I'm hearing Commissioner Gonzalez say, by way of just maybe further supporting particularly the first condition that you stated, which I took down as you believe granting the proposed variance would be contrary to the public interest. And I would maybe ask you to consider adding to that particular point that it is contrary to the public interest as described in the city's hillside development standards.
Okay, I would be happy to make that amendment. That on that particular criteria, it is contrary to. You've taken that away from I can't see it. As you said it.
So just as described in the city's hillside development standards.
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Knudsen, do you have any concern with that modification?
No.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion on the motion? And now I see the chat where Lisa Jensen beat me to the punch. You should be concerned that we're thinking that much alike, Lisa. I like her phraseology a little bit better. She got it more technically precise than I had it.
Okay, Lisa, you want to take over?
Either way, Commissioner Jensen, do you have anything to add?
No, I was just trying to help you say it succinctly because I know you were stressed that we were throwing words at you. As the staff brought this to the screen, the critical hillside overlay zone is established to provide blah, blah, blah. It basically says all the things that we've been concerned about protecting. And so I thought if you took Commissioner Gonzalez's suggestion to just refer to the code as your verbiage, and you could say, as described in the purpose and objectives of the critical hillside overlay zone outlined in 14.33A.010, then you've deferred to something that has some legal backing instead of just our thoughts and musings.
Thank you. I won't speak for Commissioner Gonzalez, but I think that's what we both had in mind with is kind of the desire to further emphasize why.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
Okay, I can't remember my motion entirely. This is my reluctance. Can
I make an effort to restate?
Yes, if you would be so kind.
Okay. And I believe I'm maybe missing a piece of the second point that you made. So feel free to help me out with that. So the motion is to deny the request for a variance to allow the applicant to impact 30% slopes to facilitate a 3-lot residential subdivision at 3605 North Foothill Drive in the R110 zone. And that is based on the findings that the proposed variance is contrary to the public interest as described in the purpose and objectives of the critical hillside overlay. And
that it would has the potential to create a substantial injustice for the uphill properties.
And then lastly, sorry, I'll let you keep going if you like. I had a third one here that was that a hardship exists, but it is not unreasonable.
Yes, that is correct. And also, if you could put back the 5 criteria, because I'm not finding them in the report.
Special circumstances.
Okay, substantial injustice. That it does impact a property right, but it is again not unreasonable, is what I believe what I said. So I hope Na has all of that.
Maybe just a question for staff right fast. Do you have any thoughts, suggestions, or do you want us to clarify that anymore?
No, I think we've been taking notes. I think we've got it.
Yeah, I would agree.
But there will be a report of action that will go out, and it will be important for Mr. Anderson for you to look at that and make sure that we've gotten it right.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Given the conversation we've had there, Commissioner Knudsen, are you comfortable with how we read that finally?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll say that we have the motion with the second. Any further discussion on the motion? Okay, seeing none. Back to the typical order for a roll call vote. To start with Commissioner Jones.
Aye.
Commissioner Jensen.
Aye.
Commissioner Urquiaga.
Aye.
Commissioner Henry.
Aye.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Aye.
Commissioner Knudsen.
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson. I just did that. I really just did that. I vote aye as well. Getting ahead of myself here. So there's 7 of us tonight. So that's 7-0. All in favor of the motion on item number 1.
Commissioner Henry vote?
Did I miss Brian? I thought I had him.
Well, you had me. I was aye.
Okay, great. Super. Well, moving on to item number 2. Staff, any discussion, anything you want for that tonight, or would you like a motion to continue?
The attorney's office is still working on the actual text of that amendment. And so if you would continue that, we'll bring it back when that's more complete.
Okay, thank you. We'll entertain a motion to continue item number 2, if anybody wants to do that.
I can do that.
Okay, Commissioner Jensen, motion to continue item number 2. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Henry, any discussion on the motion? I don't see any hands, so we'll just go all in favor.
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Maybe that's the important part. Okay. The motion to continue item number 2 carries unanimously. Is there anything else that staff wants to talk about tonight?
No, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Any objection to adjourning? Seeing none.
I so move.
Thank you, Commissioner Urquiaga. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Once again, unanimous. Thanks. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.